I just want to recap some stuff that we've been going over from the 3 arguments that we did today. Just want to point out from the cosmological argument, what we came to the conclusion is that this cause is self-existent, because you can't cause yourself. It's immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. It's extremely powerful to create our universe out of nothing. From the design argument, we said that it's intelligent and that this life has purpose. We are goal-oriented. It tells us our life has purpose as well. From the moral argument, we kind of had to run through that a little bit, and I apologize for that just for the sake of time. But we said the being is absolutely morally perfect and is personal. So that sounds pretty good. When we relate it to the attributes of what we call, or who we call, the God of the Bible, that seems to match up. And we didn't do it with a reference to the Bible, and that's okay. But what we're going to move into now, as I'm just kind of sitting here recapping, we see from these 3 arguments that anything that has to do with pantheism or atheism is ruled out. And so we're left with just a theistic view of the world. But you have 3 of them here, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You ask yourself, well, which one is true? And that's why our next topic, we're going to move into the New Testament. Because if the New Testament is true, that kind of rules out Judaism, and it definitely rules out Islam. Would you agree?
Amen.
Yeah, amen is right. All right, so we're moving into, is the New Testament true? And we're going to spend definitely 2 hours and maybe an extra hour in the morning, depending on what we get through. I was looking at it today, probably going to end up stealing that hour tomorrow morning. 2 questions for investigating the reliability of the New Testament. Do we have an accurate copy of the original documents? The reason why I say accurate copy is because we do not have the original documents. Okay? Let's not, be dishonest about it. The actual document that Paul wrote on, the actual letter that Luke penned in Acts, we do not have those copies. But there's original copies, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to us. Because what we are looking for is not the original document. We're looking for the original content of the document. If we did not have the original Declaration of Independence, could we still know what the Declaration of Independence said?
Yes.
How?
Yeah.
Through copies, exactly, and other historical documents. And so that's what we're really looking for. We just want to know, hey, what does it say? So that's the question. Do we have accurate copies of the original New Testament documents? Now, people like Bart Ehrman in his books, Jesus Interrupted and Misquoting Jesus, and some of these other people are going to tell you, oh, these documents, they've been changed down through the ages. I mean, there are thousands of mistakes. There's more mistakes than you can count. It's astronomical. They are so contradictory. They say one thing here, another thing there. There are all sorts of mistakes. Well, they kind of make a mountain out of a molehill, and we're going to see what we're talking about there. But the second question is, do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? So if we get to the conclusion, which we will, that we have an accurate copy, then we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we know that the original document told the truth? Because you can have an accurate copy of a lie, right? Yeah. I mean, I can write you a lie on a piece of paper, you copy it down, I'll burn that piece of paper, and all you have is an accurate copy of something I lied about. So how do we know that what the New Testament author said is actually true? How do we know they didn't make it up? How do we know they didn't lie? That's an important question. All right, so we're going to go over this first one. Do we have accurate copy of the New Testament documents? Now, before I forget, and I'll probably mention this a few times, especially as we get into our next PowerPoint slide, sometimes we forget that people who write books are not always honest. Right? Or that they can be wrong as well. Just because they can cite, they have a footnote that's longer than the page, doesn't mean they're right. And it's interesting that in the same year, let me see, what book was it? The Misquoting Jesus book that Bart Ehrman wrote. Okay? So he writes all about how what we have in the Gospels, they misquote what Jesus said. They wrote back in and said, well, Jesus said this, and Jesus never said those things. Like, Jesus never claimed to be God. That's something the later Christians wrote back into those documents. Nobody worshiped Jesus as God in the first couple centuries. Same year he wrote that book. He co-authors a book, and that's a popular book for people, on the everyday level, your church-going people. He co-authors a book with Bruce Metzger. Anybody know Bruce Metzger? Okay, Bruce Metzger is like the guy when it comes to Bible manuscript evidences. Okay, he co-authors a book with Bruce Metzger, and essentially comes to the conclusion, yes, we have an accurate copy of the New Testament documents. But in his popular level book, he presents the argument, oh, these things have been changed and Jesus was misquoted and they just wrote in all this sort of other stuff. Now, I don't know the man's heart, but I find it a little odd that he's going to write a book that, and think about motives here, he's going to write a book that he can sell a lot of copies of and make a lot of money. Because you're not going to make a lot of money when you write a book that says the New Testament is reliable. You're just not going to make a lot of money. But you know what? You can totally put, you can totally get your little news program out there. You can be on the History Channel. You can do all that sort of other stuff, and you get interviews, and you get invited on talk shows when you go, the Bible contradicts itself. Or the Bible has been changed. Or that's not the real Jesus of history. That's sensational stuff. Right? So, I find that a little odd. Just want to point that out, that he seems a little inconsistent there. But we're going to ask ourselves that first question. So I got 4 points for you here. We have earlier manuscripts. We have more manuscripts, more accurately copied manuscripts, and more abundantly supported manuscripts. So what do I mean by this? Got you a chart right here for these first two. Now, be very careful when you're searching the internet, because not everything you read on the internet is true. Just throw that out there, all right? But sometimes we make this mistake. Sometimes we make the mistake of looking at something on the internet that supports our view, and we just take it wholesale. Be a filter, not a sponge. There's a lot of well-intended websites out there that have outdated or misinformed information when it comes to manuscript evidence. Okay? Now, I have the latest because I am part of circles of other apologetic guys, and we have groups where we can collaborate together. And essentially, I went to a few who literally just spent the past year researching manuscript evidence. And I said, give me the latest info. Now, this stuff is constantly being updated because we find things in holes in the ground all the time. And then here's what happens. They take all these documents and they stick them in the bottom of museums, and they go, well, we got 1,000 documents here and 4,000 over there and 6,000 over there. Where do you want to start? Well, if they start over there, you got 500,000 documents that aren't being translated and aren't being looked at. And they might get looked at about 5 or 10 years from now. And it's a long process when you go, because when you translate it and you go, oh, wow, look, this is a document from Acts. How cool is that? Well, you can't just go, hey, I'm going to publish it, and you got to get a bunch of peer reviews and that sort of stuff. And it's got to go through dating, because they don't want to put something out there and then come to find out they were wrong about it, because then you kind of look like a fool, which is good, okay? So I'm just saying, be careful on your information and manuscript copies. This is the latest. It's being updated constantly, though. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will get these wrong. These guys, Pliny and Caesar's Gallic Wars, Herodotus, who was an old historian, what we read about from Homer, Livy was a historian, Aristotle. What we learn from these guys, or what people will tell you about these guys, they'll kind of misrepresent the documents that we have for them. Okay, so that's what I mean there. What does this chart show? We got time gap in the years of manuscript copies. What's a manuscript? A manuscript is simply, I write the original, right? Billy likes cheesecake. I do, love cheesecake. Right? So I'll write that down on a piece of paper. That's the original. Now all you guys, right, we pass around the room and you copy. So now that's one step removed. That's a manuscript. You have a manuscript. I got the original. You got the manuscript. So I destroy the original, right? But you guys obviously know what we say. And then you take that home to your home churches, and they all copy what you did. Now that's 2 removed, okay? But now we got more manuscripts. So let's say we got 50 people in here, and each church has 100 people in it. You times that. I don't want to do math this late at night, but then that's how many manuscripts you have, all right? So what we mean by time gap in years is this. So we destroyed the original document, right? What's the time gap between my original and when you copied it? 5 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. Then you take it home. Okay, a week, right? And then 10 years from now, they give it to somebody else and they copy it. Well, that's 10 years removed. Okay, you see how that process is working? All right, so what we have here is, with the New Testament, the gap is about 50 years. And look at all those manuscripts we had. When we add up, and I don't want to get into the minutia of it, but if you're interested in this stuff, I can point you to sources. 5,838 manuscripts. Now, you get down here to Homer, And you have here 2200, pretty decent number, you know, but 400 years removed. That means the oldest, you know, document that we have is 400 years from when he originally wrote. Herodotus, 400 years, but we only have 100 copies. Aristotle, 1400 years. How do we know stuff about Aristotle and Plato? 1400 years removed, and we have 57. Just 57. How does 57 compare to 5800? What do you think? Which one's better?
5800.
Yeah, 5800, right? How do you know things about Caesar? How do you know things about what Pliny says about the Roman government there in the early couple centuries of what we call the church? How do you know these things? Because you read these documents. And now look at the comparison. 5800 compared to 300 or 100 or 250. 50 years removed compared to 400 or 1400 or 950 or 500. So, yes, Terry.
That number for Homer, the number of manuscripts and the time gap,
Yes.
I think that number of manuscripts has gone up quite a bit since, let's say, the 60s.
That, yeah.
And the time gap's gone down quite a bit since,
Yes.
say, the 60s. But I have a copy at home of Homer that was done in the 1960s, and I read it, and I never stopped and thought, boy, this can't at all be what he wrote in the Odyssey, because look at all the new information we have, and I'm sure not all those manuscripts agree with the manuscripts they had back in the 1960s. But yet when it comes to New Testament, we find new manuscripts, and everybody says, oh, hold the horses, we got the wrong picture here. That's nonsense.
Yep, exactly. Every time we find more manuscripts, we just see that they're absolutely more and more confirmed. So as we move from this, we see that we had earlier manuscripts and other ancient documents, and we have more manuscripts and other ancient documents. So here's the point. If somebody looks at you and go, well, you can't trust the New Testament, you say, then you can't trust anything from ancient history. You can't trust anything about the Roman government. You can't trust things that you learn about Alexander the Great. You can't trust any of that stuff if you can't trust the New Testament. So it's kind of like, hey, let's put the same sort of acid test in the New Testament that we do to other historical documents. And if you're going to go to history class and you're going to accept these things about the Caesars and what they did, then how can you doubt what the New Testament says? That's not fair to have those double standards. All we're asking for is the same standards. So more accurately copied manuscripts. This is what Terry was getting into. 99.9% or 90 to 95%. I'm going to show you kind of what we mean by that. But just you might go, oh gosh, it's not 100%. Don't worry about that. Not that big of a deal. And we're going to talk about some of the, quote, discrepancies. George.
1970, I wrote a book for only 2,700 Greek manuscripts.
Oh, yeah.
Now look what you got.
Yeah. I think God has a very good sense of humor. You know, it's like with the Hittites, right? Oh, there's no Hittites. Archaeological discovery. You know, all the Old Testament, all we have is manuscripts that date way after Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, God always just lets us find these things and just confounds the wisdom of our age, as the Bible says. So, blank it out. All right, let's say I'm texting my sister. Right? She goes, hey, when are you going to come down next? And I say, next Dunday around 4 p.m. Do you want to beat at the Starbucks on Main Street for coffee? Now, you just stop right there. Right? Yeah, because you know iPhone talk to text always messes up. Just stop right there. What day am I coming down? Next Dunday.
Sunday?
Okay, Sunday, right? Do you want to beat at the Starbucks? What do you think I really mean? You want to meet. Okay, so here we have a misspelling of two words, yet you guys can figure it out from context really easy. And so my sister, though she might be a little slow, she hasn't had her coffee yet, she goes, huh? So I wrote back, next Sunday, okay? Meet at $00 p.m. Now you look on your keyboard, what number is associated with $?
8.
4. I was like, let me fool for a second. Do you want to meet, so now we got the beat versus meet, at the Starbucks on Main Street for coffee? So now my sister, she goes, oh, okay, right? She gets it. And then I'm like, well, you know, no, I want to correct this. Next Sunday at 4 p.m., do you want to meet at the Starbucks on Main Street for coffee? She says yes. Why do you think she says yes? Because she just compared these three texts, if she was super slow, and she can figure out from context exactly what I meant. This is what we do with the manuscripts that we find in the caves and in museums and wherever we find them. We lay them all out, and we go, here's a word that maybe the first letter has worn out. And we don't know, it's just over time that letter, the ink has just dried up, it's worn out. But we have 3,000 other copies of that same letter that have the full word. Or let's say the word Sunday. And 3,000 copies say sun, and then the end of the word is dried up. And then the other 3,000, the first part of the word is dried up and says day. You put those two together, Sunday. It's not even really that bad though. So, more abundantly supported manuscripts. Let's say I was just very OCD about my texting. And I sent my sister like 1,000 texts and just blew her phone up. Right? About when we want to meet. Just to make sure that we're meeting at the right Starbucks at the right time on the right day. Alright? You think by comparing all those different texts, she could figure it out? She had to be super slow if she couldn't. This is exactly what we do with the New Testament. Like I said, we lay out all these manuscripts, all 5,800 of them, and we look at them, and we can compare. Here's the deal. We know where the discrepancies are. It's not like we're sitting there going, well, we just don't know where the Bible might mess itself up. We know exactly where the discrepancies are, and they're not that big of a deal. Most of them are things to do with punctuation, a misspelling of a word, like spelling color, C-O-L-O-U-R, instead of O-R, right? It's just things that are not that big of a deal. For example, you have one, you'll see footnotes in your Bible that sometimes say, well, early manuscripts will have this. Take a big one. You remember when Jesus and the disciples said, hey, we tried to, excommunicate this demon, we couldn't figure it out. And Jesus said, this one only comes out by prayer and fasting. Some manuscripts say just prayer. Oh my gosh, throw it all out, right? No. So what do? You come across a demon, you pray and fast. Just do both. Be safe, right? So those sort of things are not going to completely demolish our trust in the reliability of Scripture. So this man is named Diocletian. He was the emperor right before Constantine. He tried to get all the Bibles. They didn't have Bibles, but he's trying to get all the manuscript stuff together and all the kind of Bibles that they're starting to put together. And he's trying to burn them, throw them away, and all this sort of other stuff. Well, obviously he failed, because God is more powerful than a Roman emperor. But let's just say he did. Let's just say he got all the manuscripts of the New Testament documents from the first century and burned them all to the ground. Would that mess up or hurt us in discovering what the original New Testament document said? Not too much. You want to know why? Because we can go to a source called the Patristics, which is the early church fathers. So the apostles trained men to be evangelists and to be elders. And those men, like Justin Martyr and Tertullian and Papias and Irenaeus and all these other guys who kind of descend, like that next generation or two or three right after the apostles, quote the New Testament or allude to every single verse in the New Testament outside of 11 verses. And those 11 verses really look, all scripture's God-breathed, but they're not big deal verses. It's not like, they never quote John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and was with God, and the Word was God. It's like little small stuff that they don't quote. They might not quote 2 John. Big deal. Like that's not going to destroy the belief that Jesus came from God, was God, born of a virgin, died for our sins, rose from the dead. Okay? They quote all that sort of stuff. So we can reproduce the entire New Testament outside of 11 verses just from their quotes. So, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? Absolutely we do. Better than any other ancient source document or any other, history known to man. Do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? Now, that's a whole separate story. And by the way, this presentation is an overview of the New Testament evidence. After this hour, we're going to get into next hour and probably in the morning hour, we're going to get into the real guts of how do you take the scriptures and show that they're reliable. We're going to talk about all that. Okay, so I got 6 E's for you. 6 E's. The evidence the New Testament is true. The first E is early testimony. It's important that we have early testimony. Somebody tell me why it's important that we have early testimony.
Closer to the source, the more accurate.
Exactly. If you're closer to the source, then we would say it's most likely that you don't have time for legend and myth and embellishes to creep in. So people like Bart Ehrman are going to want to tell you, right, that you have Jesus' ministry, but then you have the church councils. The question is, when did the gospel writers, whoever they are, write? Did they write closer to the church councils, or did they write closer to the life of Jesus? Now, obviously, we as Christians are going to want to hope that we can say they wrote closer to Jesus' ministry so that we can do away with the arguments of skeptics who will say, well, they were written 3 centuries, 4 centuries later by people who didn't even know Jesus. And what they wrote was basically full of embellishments, full of, putting statements into the mouth of Jesus that he never said. I mean, look, when you have 3 centuries that go by, you have a lot of time for legend and all that sort of other stuff to creep in. But let's say I try to convince you guys that 5 years ago, the Chinese invaded the Midwest, took over Indiana, and turned it into a communist state. Could I convince anybody in this room of that? Why not? You were eyewitnesses. You're like, I don't remember anything of that. I never saw anything on Facebook. There was nothing on Fox News, right? You're like, I don't even have Facebook. My kids didn't tell me about anything happening on Facebook. There's nothing on Fox News. There's nothing in the newspaper. You go around town, I don't see any, Chinese flags. I don't see any, Think about this. How are the gospel writers going to write documents that claim Jesus was born of a virgin, he was born of a certain lineage, he did miracles, right? 2 people who were still living in that day, and that he was crucified by a man named Pontius Pilate and the Romans, And then his tomb was empty and he arose from the dead and he appeared miraculously for a period of 40 days and showed himself to over 500 people. And they're going to do that. They're going to make all that up, and then they're going to come in and convince thousands of people and start this great movement that changed the world. I'm sorry, I just don't have enough faith to believe that. And I don't think that 3 years or 5 years or even 10 years is enough time to allow for legend to creep in, because you still have the people who were alive when Jesus was alive. And they could say, that never happened. There was no paralytic man. There was no blind man. There was no empty tomb. You see what I'm saying? So we're going to want to say that the gospel writers are over here, but how do we do that? Well, we got some major first century events. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. It was besieged in 69 AD. And those are big monumental events that happened in the first century, right? Well, Paul is martyred around 64 to 67 AD, sometime in there, conservative numbers, depending on how you want to date it. And James, the half-brother of Jesus, is killed in 61 AD. In fact, what the Jews did was they took him on top of the Temple Mount, they chucked him off, and they realized he was not dead, so they went down and beat him to death. Yeah, so they killed him. And we are going to say here that Luke writes Acts in 60 AD. Let's just say around 60. Now, why would we say that? All right, here's why we're going to say that. Let's ask this question. How does the book of Acts end?
Paul's first in prison.
Paul's in prison, right? He's sitting there in Rome under house arrest. So Paul's not dead yet. If you read a book of the history of Lower Manhattan, and it describes the buildings, and the different economy and Statue of Liberty and all this other stuff, yet you don't read anything about the World Trade Centers being hit with planes. When might you suspect that book was written? Before 9/11. Because you would expect that if it's written post 9/11, if somebody's going to write a book today about Lower Manhattan, why in the world would they not put in there about the World Trade Centers being bombed? If you read a book, a biography about Martin Luther King Jr., and they do not tell you about his assassination, you might think, this was written before he died. So we have Luke here writing before, doesn't tell us anything about Paul being martyred, doesn't tell us anything about James being martyred. Why is that important? Well, you do realize Paul told us about a couple martyrdoms. Luke tells us about a couple martyrdoms. Who does he tell us was killed? Stephen, Acts chapter 7, and James the Apostle, not James the half. This is James, half brother of Jesus. James the Apostle. Who are the two main characters in the book of Acts? Peter and Paul, right? So why in the world would Luke write a book that chronicles, the major apostle to the Jews, the major apostle to the Gentiles? You get to the end of the book, you read nothing of the temple being destroyed, nothing of Paul being martyred, nothing of James being martyred, nothing of Peter being martyred. Why in the world would he leave that sort of stuff out?
Because it was written before those.
Most likely because he wrote the gospel before that ever happened. And think about the apologetic value. If Luke, or whoever it was, wrote after the temple was destroyed, what did Jesus predict in Matthew chapter 24? Think? Destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? George and Terry was going over that a couple days ago. Tell me the apologetic value of being able to sit down and write and go, we hate to say we told you so. Right? I mean, if I'm writing the gospel after the temple was destroyed and the one I'm following predicted it was going to happen, 40 years before it happened, I'm going to put that in there and be like, told you Jesus was from God. How can he predict the future, But he doesn't do that. Now, we're going to say that Luke writes the gospel before 60 AD. Why?
He wrote it before Acts.
We know he wrote it before Acts because here in Acts chapter 1 he says, in my former book, O Theophilus, I wrote about all Jesus began to do and teach. What book is that? The Gospel of Luke. And, this is cool, I don't know if you ever noticed this or not. 1 Timothy 5:17 through 18 says, the elders who direct the affairs of the church were worthy of double honor, especially those who work in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, don't muzzle the ox, watch, tread not the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. What scripture says that? What scripture is he referring to? Luke 10:6 through 7. Whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Paul was quoting part of Deuteronomy and part of Luke's writings, because that very phrase comes from Luke right there. It doesn't come from Deuteronomy. So Paul is quoting the Gospel of Luke. And we're just going to venture out on a limb here and say that Paul wrote his letters before he died. You guys agree with that? Okay. So we're going to think that Paul wrote all of his letters pre-65 AD. Right? And here he is quoting the Gospel of Luke, which means the Gospel. If you're going to quote something, it has to already be in existence. You following that train of logic? Let me give you another one. Now you guys kind of jumping the gun. You know what's going on. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul is talking about what Jesus said here with communion, Last Supper. And he says, the Lord on the night he was betrayed took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is given to you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it, or in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Where does it come from? Look at all those words directly quoted from Luke 22:19 through 20. Word for word. And we know that Luke was a companion of who? Paul. So it makes perfect sense here if Paul is quoting verbatim the Gospel of Luke, and Paul and Luke are companions, that Luke wrote his Gospel, and that Paul also probably sat down and was like, here, and then quoted him. Yeah, that's right. Paul said, I got a degree from Gamaliel. Let me, All right. Now, Luke obviously wasn't an eyewitness, but he went and investigated the eyewitnesses. He was probably also able to investigate Paul. Paul did see the risen Lord. I think Paul spent a few years in the presence of Jesus in the time in between, like when he really got his ministry kicked off after the Damascus Road experience. That's just my personal opinion. Regardless, he did see the risen Lord, and he was an apostle who received divine revelation. But I also think Luke went and investigated some of the other eyewitnesses as well. He tells us that in Luke chapter 1. I put here Mark writes his gospel before Luke. Now, I don't necessarily care either way on which gospel you think was written first, We're just putting that up there because what scholars will say is, oh, well, if you look at Luke's gospel, he probably has about 350 verses that are direct quotes from Mark's gospel. So obviously Mark wrote before him. Well, if you're going to take that train of logic and we just did this, then fine. We'll date Mark at 45 AD. That's cool by me, right? So we're just kind of playing on the skeptic's field there. All right, eyewitness testimony. So we got early testimony, which is good. The Gospels were written there close to the time of Jesus. Eyewitness testimony. Why is it important? What's the greatest piece of evidence you can bring into the court of law? Not just one. Multiple eyewitnesses. Because when you have multiple eyewitnesses and their stories match up, then you know, for most point, that they're telling the truth. And we're going to talk about conspiracy theories tomorrow morning, by the way, for anybody who's a conspiracy theory nut. All right, eyewitness testimony, historical crosshairs in the text. Get ready. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod Tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip Tetrarch of Iturea, and Trachonius and Lysanias Tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priest of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John the son of Zechariah in the desert, Luke 3:1-2. Now, that does not sound like once upon a time in a far, far away galaxy or in Middle Earth there was a king. Does that sound like that? No, look. What Luke is doing is he's giving you an exact crosshair of when this happened so that you can go back and talk to these people or talk to the people who live in this day and said, hey, did Jesus ever do this? Did Jesus ever say that? And the people can say, yeah, I remember that parable. I remember that miracle. I remember him doing this. I remember him cleansing the temple. You see what Luke is doing? It's like if I said, in the first year of the second term of Obama administration, Joe Biden's vice president and Hillary Clinton has already been removed from Secretary of State. You would know pretty much exactly of what I'm talking about, what day, what year I'm talking about. That's what Luke is doing. These Gospels are not ambiguous on this sort of stuff. He's not making up a story. The exact date's given, AD 29. See, we can go back into history and we can see when is it that all these things match up. The 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate's governor, Herod's tetrarch, Philip's tetrarch. When can we go and trace all the Roman documents and see that these guys were in these situations? 29 AD. All 8 people are known from history. All were known to live at this exact time. This is not a once upon a time story. All right. Now this one's cool, and I'm going to give you a couple more specifics about this when we get, I think later on tonight in the next session. But in Acts, there's 84 historically confirmed details. There's this basically, can't remember if he's an archaeologist or a historian. I'll know in the next slideshow. But essentially what he did was he went through the later part of Acts, essentially when Paul starts his ministry. He combs through it with a fine-tooth comb. He finds 84 historically confirmed facts. And when I say historically confirmed facts, I mean Luke gets it right when it comes to obscure rulers in small towns in the Mediterranean. He gets where do storms come from at what time of year. Like, if I asked you when the rainy season was in Cameroon, how many of you guys would know that? You can't use your Google. Just go ahead and tell me. Anybody know? Yeah, why don't you know?
It's after.
Well, you know why, because you got an eyewitness there. The rest of us don't know. His son-in-law is like my best friend. He's in Cameroon. That's why I gave that example. Thanks for breaking my illustration. But he tells you when monsoon, or not monsoons, but when certain wind patterns happen. He tells you the way the sea moves. He tells you where the shore gets shallow around certain islands. He tells you the depths of water. In fact, what's really cool is he tells you about the depths of water off the coast of Malta. Because remember when Paul and them were traveling, and what did they do with the anchors? Do you remember? They dropped the anchors. Now, there's actually a archaeologist, Bob Cornuke, who went over and he said, okay, the tourist location is on this side of the island, but according to the patterns of the ocean and what Luke described, I'm going to go on this side of the island, right? And they found anchors off the shore. Pretty interesting, right? It's like the Gospels and the book of Acts. We're telling real history. So I'm going to give you a few more of those 84 historically confirmed details a little bit later. But if Luke's going to get like things like, hey, what was the proper name, proper title of a ruler in this little podunk town on the Mediterranean coast? If he's going to get details like that right, why would we think that he's not able to get big details right? Okay? That's the point. Luke includes more in his gospel, and John has a bunch in his gospel. But I want to read to you this. Archaeologist William Ramsey, he says this: I began with a mind unfavorable to it, that is the book of Acts. But more recently, I found myself brought into contact with the book of Acts as an authority for topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. So he said, look, I started off, I thought this book was junk. But the more I studied it, the more I realized, wow, you can trust this thing. Pretty cool, huh? That's an archaeologist saying that, not a Christian. Roman historian, Anne Sherman White. For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. In fact, one guy who was, I can't remember his name off the hand, but he's a buddy of a friend of mine who teaches at Western Michigan. Okay, so my buddy's named Dr. McGrew, but his colleague taught Roman history for like 50 years. And McGrew tells me that this guy says, because he's got a raspy voice, he goes, Luke is the best historian I've ever read. That's pretty cool. When you got a guy who teaches Roman history for 50 years, and he says that about the book of Acts and Luke, that's awesome. Eric.
Maybe we're pointing out that accurate history writing is not the norm for that time period. That's true. Luke is the exception to the rule.
There you go.
And the other gospel writers, of course.
Oh, well, yeah.
But they're the exception. I mean, the New Testament really is the exception to the rule.
Yeah, like even with Josephus, we're going to quote Josephus a lot in the next couple of sessions, but even with him, I mean, he embellishes stuff, you know. So, I mean, Terry's right. Okay, so we're going to skip over to 2 and 3, but New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources of archaeology. This is important because when you read the Book of Mormon, right, and they talk about cities, and they talk about peoples, and coins, and you go start digging in the dirt and you're like, we got nothing. Now, does silence or does absence of evidence mean that they were false? No, not per se, because there was an absence of evidence of the Hittites for a while. The Bible was still true about it. Why? Because we came around and we finally found there's evidence for it. So what it does, though, is when your entire book has no archaeology to back it up, it kind of really makes you look bad. Okay? It's different with the Bible when you have an abundance of archaeology backing up the Bible, but then you still have a question, let's say, about the city of Jericho. Okay, well, I got 1,000 pieces of archaeological evidence that support the Bible, and I got one question over here. Give the benefit of the doubt. But when you have 1,000 questions and no evidence, you just can't give the benefit of the doubt. What I have here, though, is 30 people confirmed in secular archaeological sources. Think about this. The Agrippas, Claudius, Felix, Gamaliel, Augustus, Herodias, Judas of Galilee, Pilate, Tiberius Caesar. All these guys listed in the New Testament can be found in secular sources. In fact, this is a stone that has Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, discovered in 1961, coastal town of Caesarea. Josephus also mentions Pontius Pilate. This is cool. This is an ossuary box. What's an ossuary box? Anybody know?
Bone box.
A bone box, right? Does anybody know when they used limestone ossuary bone boxes to bury the Jews? Anybody know? From 20 BC to 70 AD. That's when they used them, right? From 20 BC to 70 AD. You know what's written on the side here? Can anybody read that chicken scratch Greek? Caiaphas. Caiaphas. This is the ossuary box of the high priest who had Jesus sentenced to death. We have his bones. Isn't that cool? I don't know, I find that cool. Discovered in 1990. We also have this. I mean, we take some of these things for granted, but we have this. We've discovered, how they did crucifixions. And we know that crucifixion happened in the 1st century. Kind of important. Kind of an important detail that we know crucifixions actually took place in the 1st century. If you can't make that connection, I can't help you. All right. In extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key points of the stories of Israel's patriarchs, the Exodus, David's monarchy, and the life and times of Jesus. Well, dang, that sounds like most of the Bible, don't you think? I mean, that's all the important stuff. the patriarchs, the Exodus, the monarchy, and then Jesus? I'll take that.
Amen.
The archaeological evidence, and here again, not a Christian guy, per se. All right, moving on. Embarrassing testimony. Somebody tell me why it's important that we're saying, you know what, the New Testament has embarrassing details about the apostles in it. They wrote it, but they left in the details that were kind of embarrassing to themselves. Why is that?
Makes them real.
Right? Nobody's gonna, like, if I'm writing a biography about myself, I'm not putting my blunders in there. Right? I'm gonna put in all the good stuff about me. Why am I gonna make myself look bad? I mean, look, that's just how people are. Let's just admit it. That's just how people are. And taking a step back, if we were to be just a historian, trying to take away, we're not Christians, we're just historians. One thing that historians do in order to try to, confirm whether a statement is true in a historical document is they say, if it is embarrassing to the author, it's most likely to be true because people don't leave in embarrassing details. Okay? So, when you go through the New Testament, you see a lot of embarrassing details. Just a historian looking at it would go, well, those are pretty sure to be true because there's no reason why the apostles would write those in there. Let me do this. Hi. How about that? Somebody tell me an embarrassing detail that the apostles left in there about themselves. Anybody know?
Peter.
Peter denying the Lord.
Peter's whole story. Peter denied the Lord. One time Peter is called Satan by Jesus. Right? How would you like that? I mean, look, we're going to find that most of the patristics tell us that Mark wrote his gospel according to Peter's preaching. Okay?
And he mentions about the man leaving the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Could you imagine Mark writing his gospel and going, all right, Peter, tell me that story one more time. And then Peter looks down and goes, well, I mean, you ain't got to leave in there that Jesus called me Satan. You can kind of scratch that detail out. I mean, we don't have to put that in there. All right, what else? What else?
James and John fighting over who's best.
Right? Hey, we want to sit at your right hand, and then the other apostles like, who do you think you are? What else?
Because their mama came in and did it.
Yeah, their mom came in and did. Yeah, that's embarrassing. That's really embarrassing.
About Paul correcting Peter.
Yeah, that's not in the Gospels, but yeah, Paul correcting Peter, rebuking him. What else? Doubting Thomas. Come on, guys, I wasn't there. It's not fair. Right? You guys send me out for lattes? Not fair.
Jesus said there, "Why you guys are so dull."
I mean, how many times did he say that? Man, you guys are slow of faith, slow and weak of faith. You little faith. Why are you doubting? I mean, all these sort of details. So we got there again with it. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying. I mean, Jesus, there's one point, I think it's in the Gospel of Luke, where he goes, essentially, this is my paraphrase, Jesus stopped being ambiguous, and he just told them straight up, I'm going to die, I'm going to be crucified by the hands of these Jews, but I'm going to rise again from the dead. And they were like, I don't understand. But all right, whatever you say, Jesus. I don't know what to tell you anymore. They're uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus. Not once, but twice. Twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. Who's the one who buried Jesus?
Joseph the Arimathea.
A Sanhedrin member. The very group who pushed to have Jesus killed. And he's the one who sticks his neck out to have Jesus buried. Right? And they're the ones who are running and scared up, scared in the room. Don't want nothing to do with it. Yeah, way to go, guys. Let's leave those details in there. They're rebuked. Yeah, and there's your Paul rebukes Peter. How about Jesus? They're doubters. How about Jesus? Is there any details about Jesus that are embarrassing?
He did lose his temper.
What?
He did lose his temper at the temple.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, maybe. I can see that.
He's left behind and everything his parents.
Right? Talking to the Samaritan woman, that could be weird.
Some people would say when he wept would be embarrassing.
Okay. What was he called? By his enemies.
He had a demon.
Demon possessed?
Beelzebub.
Friends of sinners? You friend of tax collectors, prostitutes. What else?
Hung naked on the cross.
Hung naked on the cross. Didn't they also call him a drunkard? You eat and drink with sinners, you're a drunkard.
You're illegitimate.
You're illegitimate? Yeah, that's another one. So Peter denies him. One of his closest buddies denies him 3 times. Right? Then one of his other buddies betrays him. The disciples run away. Let's see here. Come on. All right. They seize him to take him home. Remember that time when his family came and said he was crazy? And they come and take him home. He's not believed by his own brothers. He's thought to be a deceiver. He's called a madman, called a drunkard, called demon-possessed. He has a prostitute touch him? That's embarrassing. He's crucified despite the fact that anyone who is hung on a tree is cursed by God. You see? Embarrassing details. And when you take all these things together, you go, wow. All right, look, if you're making it up, if you're making up a story about Jesus, and you're writing his genealogy to show that he is the son of David, the son of Abraham, he has the rightful rule to the throne. You're just making it up, though. Let's go ahead and throw in a prostitute. Tamar and Rahab. Let's just go ahead and throw them in there. Why would you do that? I mean, why would you do that unless it's true? This doesn't make sense. All right, excruciating testimony. That is, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow morning, that all the apostles died for their faith. Why is that important?
You don't want to die for something they don't believe is true.
That is important, but we're going to take it a step further. Nobody's going to die for something they don't believe is true, but you have people today who will die for what they believe is true and they're wrong. Muslims will die today for what they believe is true and they're wrong. We're going to take that a step further. Well, let's even think further. They were willing to go through torture and death, and they look at their beliefs and practices before and after, right? So they're Jews, okay? So you got animal sacrifice, but now you give that up, your ancestral traditions, something you've grown up on, for the ultimate sacrifice of Christ. Binding law of Moses, freed from the law, Christ's life. Strict monotheism. Now you believe in a Trinity? Even if they didn't use that word, they still believe Jesus was God. The Sabbath, Sunday worship, not saying Sunday's the new Sabbath. I'm only saying where they used to worship here on the Sabbath, now they are getting together to worship Jesus on Sunday. Conquering Messiah, right? Now they believe in a sacrificial Messiah. Radical different view there. I mean, you read N.T. Wright, and he really shows you what the Jews were thinking about having a conquering Messiah. Circumcision, now they believe in baptism and communion. Not saying baptism is the equivalent of circumcision, only saying we have kind of different customs going on now. All right? What in the world would happen in a person's life to make them change religion that much? Drastic, impactful event. Let me ask you this question. Where were you on 9/11, 2001? Do you remember? We all remember why.
Because of the event.
Because it was an impactful event. Look, I remember I was in study hall in 12th grade. I remember that we had the substitute. She was mean, and she never let us do anything. We always had to be quiet. We always had to do our homework. Imagine that. Huh, what a lady. But that day, for some reason, she allowed us to listen to the radio. And we were listening to the music. And then all of a sudden, breaks in, and we heard the report. I remember it like yesterday. I can't remember what I wore 2 weeks ago. Heck, I can't even remember what I wore 2 days ago. Right? But how can I remember something that happened 15 years ago? Impactful events. Impactful events can really change your life. Excruciating testimony. We're going to kind of answer these some later on, but what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they have to gain? Yeah, let me see. So, booted out of the synagogues, chased down like bandits, your family might give up on you, your wife might leave you, you're tortured, you lose your money, and you're killed. Sounds great. Sign me up. Yeah, I don't think so. Now, this is the difference, or this is the crux of the matter. What's the difference? There's people today who are willing to die for what they believe in. So how is it that we're saying the apostles are in a different category?
If it was a lie, they knew it was a lie.
That's the kicker. The disciples stood in a place to know 100% beyond any doubt whether they were lying or whether they were telling the truth. They knew. Now see, look, Muslims today, they don't know with 100%. They might have a certain level of certainty, but they cast their lot that Muhammad was a messenger of God, and they're willing to die for it. Whatever evidence they think they have. But they're basing that on a belief in Muhammad, and a belief in other things. Whereas these guys, the apostles, stood in a place to know. They were first-hand eyewitnesses. They knew, I'm making this up, I'm lying about it, or I'm telling the truth. So if you stood in that place, and you knew you were lying, why would you allow somebody to torture you? And we're going to really dive into that one and show you kind of conspiracy theories and why they fall apart tomorrow morning. So that one's really, really cool. Expected testimony. George touched on this today. This is really, really important. One thing that I feel like we leave out a lot of times when it comes to apologetics, when it comes to trying to convince people that the Bible's true, is fulfilled prophecy. Fulfilled prophecy is huge. The early church used fulfilled prophecy to show the pagans that the law, the prophets, are divinely inspired by God. So we got Jesus of a human race, the line of David in Bethlehem. He's going to come. He's both God and man. He visits the temple. He dies around 30 AD. And he rises from the dead. Isaiah 53, 10 through 11. Now, if you're interested in that, you can go pick up George's Eternal Struggle. And you can go through that and kind of see some of these lines. But that puts a bullseye here of the Old Testament having this one scarlet thread running through it the whole way. It's all, I mean, I teach people this all the time when I do discipleship. Like, the Old Testament's not just some sort of hodgepodge buffet of stories randomly thrown in there so you can tell some cool BBS stuff. No. It all is about Jesus. It's all one big movement. And it's about God setting the stage for this Messiah to come into a context so that people would understand what his ministry and what his life was really all about. So that's huge. Expected testimony. Extra biblical testimony. We're going to dive into this one a little bit later tonight and even tomorrow morning. That is 10 ancient non-Christian sources, including historians like Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius and Thales and government officials, Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan and such. We compile all that they say about Christianity, and here's what we get. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. They don't believe it, but they at least say people claimed he was the Messiah. He was crucified under a guy named Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. Not that he actually did, but at least the disciples believed it. His disciples were willing to die for that belief. Christianity spread rapidly over the Roman Empire, and his disciples denied the Romans God and worshiped Jesus as God. Would you disagree with any of that? Isn't that exactly what the New Testament says? That's exactly what the New Testament says, and we get that from non-Christian sources. That's a huge support for telling us the New Testament is true. And we're going to dive really deep into that over the next couple lessons. All right, so that's our summary. Those are our 6 E's. It's fact, not fiction. If it says Jesus said it, then Jesus really said it. If it says Jesus did it, then Jesus really did it. And Jesus claimed and proved to be God. How did he do that? By fulfilling prophecy. That's a big one. Living a sinless life, a miraculous life, predicting and accomplishing his resurrection. If Jesus is God, then anything he teaches is true. And he taught the Old Testament was the Word of God. And he taught us that he was going to inspire the New Testament writers so that their writings were accurate. Therefore, the whole Scriptures are accurate. All right. We are time for our 10-minute break. And Terry, you got anything? All right, 10-minute break, guys. We'll come back and we're going to dive into, get your scriptures out, get your Bibles out. And let me just say this real quick. The next PowerPoint that we're going to go over, I don't have notes for you, but I'll give you that PowerPoint. So if you just want it, give me your email. I'll just email you the whole PowerPoint so that way you ain't got to worry about taking notes. All right? 10-minute break.